join me in welcoming our speaker, Paul Brasler.
Honor to be here. I'm used to teaching a bunch of therapists. I'd rather not. Nothing against therapists. Therapists are some of my best friends, but you won't find anybody more critical about my field than me. But tonight I want to talk more about how I got here. That's what I was asked to do. So I call this unintended destinations. And so if you just bear with me, I was asked to kind of tell a little bit of my story, which is weird because usually I don't do that. Usually I'm talking about case studies and I'm talking about examples from practice and things like that. Or whenever I can, I talk about my kids or how awesome my wife is, that's all easy to do. So I was challenged by Jeremy and Justin to kind of say, no, we want to hear, how did you get here? And I thought, well, that's a nice challenge. Thanks, guys. And that was after I'd agreed to talk. So if you want to make God laugh, tell God what you want to do with your life. Now, I'm not the first one to say that, but that really rings true. I don't remember being super resolute in my plans for my life when I was young. I'm 53 years old right now. I don't know how that happened. I was just catching up with my good friend Melanie in the middle table there. We've known each other for about 25 years. We knew each other. I knew her husband and her. She knew my wife and I before any of us had kids. Now they've got 3 kids. We've got 3 kids. I've got a kid headed to college. She's like, how did that happen? And I'm like, you tell me. So here we are. So when I was young, I was more directionless than anything else. I was angry. I was an angry kid. I was an angry adult. Because I learned with anger comes power. If you're angry, you can keep people away from you. You can keep people from getting close to you. And so I spent a lot of my life being angry. But here I am, a middle-aged guy who's married, a father of 3 awesome boys, and a clinical social worker for almost 30 years. How did I get here? Well, it's not what I intended, at least not the social work part. So I believed in God from an early age. I honestly can't explain it. But even though I believed in God, I did not believe in the church. And I still struggle with the church. The churches I attended growing up in Louisville, Kentucky were full of phony people, in my opinion. They dressed up on Sundays, listened to the same service that you could set your watch to because I was Baptist, nothing against that, but you could set your watch by it. If we weren't out by 12:01, somebody was going to get in trouble. So I saw people that were sat through the same service every week, and then they, to me, appeared to be jerks the rest of the time. So I went to church when I had to, but I avoided it for the most part. But when I got older, I was lucky enough to have my family join a church that was rather progressive in a good way. In between incompetent and abusive youth pastors, the interim youth pastor we had was a licensed clinical social worker who would step in when needed. Her name is Sharon. And probably more than anybody else, she inspired me in a very soft way to think about helping other people. I was actually able to go back and talk with her about this a few years ago. It's really cool to connect. So my 11th grade teacher, though, told me that during the school year, he walked up to my desk. He was a quirky guy named Mr. Wilson, and he looked at me and he pointed to a paper I turned in and he goes, son, you can write. That was the first time I had a teacher tell me something good about myself. The rest of them had told me that I was underperforming, that I was not really college material, things like that. But he said, son, you can write. And I said, why do I have an F on the paper, though? He said, because I know you're not doing your best. Rewrite it. I rewrote it. I got a D-. He said, rewrite it. I got a D-. He said, rewrite it. He was that kind of teacher. Eventually, I got an A. So I thought, wow, maybe I could be a writer. So I started working on my first book in high school. And it was a novel about a teenager that I wanted to be. A teenager who fell in love with a girl, a real girl actually, that I had a crush on for years. And it was a horrible book. It was horrible. It was embarrassing. But I wrote it and I let my friends read it and they were impressed by the realism. At least that's what they told me. So I graduated high school with lousy grades and a plan to become a writer. So I came to Virginia from Louisville, was able to attend a not a bad school, but not so great school, and to start over. And so after a couple years of getting good grades, I transferred to Mary Washington. Go Eagles. And I did that at the start of my junior year. My plan was to continue in creative writing. God was still there, but I ignored him. I kind of paid him a little bit of attention, but also did my own thing. And that changed, though, during my senior year because a girl ran me over with her bike. And she and I became friends, and through her I learned about a summer camp for inner city kids from Richmond, Virginia. I'd never been to Richmond. And the camp is in Bath County. It's still there today. It's called Camp Oculana. It's run by Baptist churches and other churches around Virginia. It's the oldest continually operating residential camp in Virginia. And so I wound up going there even though I was not an accomplished outdoorsman. I hated bugs. And I'd also not worked with challenging kids before. But this wound up being another unintended destination. And for the first time in my life, I truly experienced Christian community. And I finally began the process of surrendering to Christ. That process began with a conversation with a 13-year-old young man. One day, whom I had noticed, he would get out of bed in the cabin, and he would get on his knees and he would pray. And I heard him say, "Thank you for waking me up this morning." And I said to him one day, I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, I'm glad I didn't die in my sleep." And I said, "Why do you think you die in your sleep?" He says, "Well, where I live in Hillside, sometimes bullets come through the wall and they kill people in their sleep." So here I am, a kid from the Midwest. I didn't grow up in great situations with a single mom, and we certainly were not wealthy, but I wasn't worried about that growing up. And I began to go, wow, this kid here in America is living in a different world. So this young man and I had more conversations, and during one of them, he asked me what I believed. He asked me point blank. He was 13, and he said, "What do you believe?" I was 21, and I couldn't answer him. My convictions and my beliefs were vague, and while I had been baptized as a Christian, I had not surrendered. That summer I did, and that unintended destination led to a complete rerouting of my life. From academia, because at that point I wanted to be a writer. I thought maybe I would be a professor of medieval literature. I have no idea why I thought that at the time because I don't read it now. But where do you start? It's 1993. What do you do with an English degree in 1993? Well, the answer is not much. So I settled into a part-time position as a youth pastor. I worked at a drugstore. And during this time, I decided that I wanted to work with young people in a treatment setting because I continued to work at the camp in the summertime. And that's how I wound up in Richmond. So I spent a year at seminary, earning a degree in Christian education, and then began working on my master's in social work. I felt I'd found my calling. I was going to work with adolescents in a treatment setting, possibly a Christian treatment setting. This is what I was going to do. So while working part-time on my MSW, I worked in a residential treatment program that's actually just down the street called UMFS. I worked there for 7 years. It was challenging. I worked exceptionally long hours. I was young, so it didn't matter. It was sometimes violent because we had kids that were really hurting, and sometimes the way they hurt out was to hurt other people, including us. So halfway through my MSW program, I had to provide input with the school, with VCU, on where they would place me for my first internship. So they asked me which population I wanted to work with the least. And being the trustworthy and naive soul that I was and probably still am, I didn't see through the trick question. So I wrote down, this is exactly what I wrote. People who are addicts because they can help it. I mean, how self-righteous is that? So what did the school do? They promptly placed me in a drug treatment facility for women who were IV drug users. That internship lasted the entire summer of 1997, and it was difficult. But while I sweated in an overcrowded building that lacked AC, had chronic sewage failures, and always smelled of fried bologna, I do not know why. Probably because of what they cooked a lot. I learned that I knew nothing about substance use disorder or addiction, or the people living with it. I also became fascinated by the variety of chemical compounds, most of them occurring in nature, that could radically change how a person thinks, feels, and acts. Without trying, a whole new direction in my life opened up. And these were just some examples of the unintended destinations in my life. I wound up actually working, I've continued to work in the field of substance use treatment. I also right now am a therapist, and I work with psychedelic medication. So I've really been quite lucky in my career. So these were the first examples of unintended destinations in my life. And I really think that God has been behind them all. And there are more examples. There were more examples to come, including a ridiculously ironic story of how I asked my wife out on our first date. But I'm not going to tell you that right now because she tells the story a whole lot better. I can also point to unintended destinations to where a ministry I thought that I was headed to for years, a door shut, suddenly one weekend, and how in hindsight that was the best thing that never happened to me. So regardless of whether a door is open or closed, or a chance encounter leads to a lifelong relationship, we need to acknowledge that God is at work in our lives. We may not be able to see or feel this all the time, but God is there nonetheless. And the most important thing about unintended destinations is seeing that the journey, which is ongoing, is far more educational than what we perceive to be the end point. So I don't know what's next for me. And I really don't care. I'm just going to keep on trying. So that's what I mean by unintended destinations. And that's all I got for that. So I don't know if we're going to do a question and answer or anything like that. Jordan, help me out. All right. Again, I'm used to doing more of a training thing than anything else, so anyhow. But the part of the reason I will say as we talk about this is a nice segue for this is that, and if Jordan wants to speak more to it, we are going to be distributing this mental health handbook, resource handbook to faith community. This really looks great too, guys. It's the first time I've actually seen the final copy. We have to talk about issues of mental health. We have to talk about issues of substance use disorder, which is another word for addiction. We have to talk about trauma. We have to talk about things like human trafficking because they are an inherent part of the fabric of our society. Our churches are not immune to it. Our workplaces are not immune to it. The people struggling with these things are not bad people in the least bit, but they're often alone. They're often hurting. And if we can be that safe person, if we can be that person that somebody can go to and say, I just need you to listen to me, that can make a difference. There's a lot of pain out there right now, and I think that what we've seen with the shutdowns related to the pandemic is that those lines and I think things have become more fragile. I'm seeing it in my practice, whether it's seeing people utilizing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or doing just regular psychotherapy, I'm seeing a lot of pain. And so I think the thing is we've got to be able to address it. And we've got to make it safe, for lack of a better word, for people to be able to talk about it. So this is where we could start. So I'm happy to entertain questions however you want to do it.